Star Wars is a film and TV franchise that's so successful, it's made more money than there are stars in the Triangulum Galaxy. But in spite of its tens of billions in revenue and incalculable cultural impact, the out-of-this-world saga set in a galaxy far, far away seems to have forgotten the importance of one of the most basic things in storytelling: stakes. What are stakes exactly? Well, they're strong posts with a point at the end that can be driven into the ground to support something, like tents or wacky arm-waving inflatable tube men. But they're also one of the core elements of telling a story. Stakes are what's gained or lost when a character either achieves or doesn't achieve their goals. They're the consequences of actions. For this video, that will be the definition we're focusing on. Stakes are what make a viewer care. This is because it ropes them into wanting to know the outcome of things. If the Avengers don't defeat Thanos before he attains all 6 Infinity Stones, he'll wipe out half the universe. If Steve doesn't find all the Blue's clues, she won't be able to eat her snack. But Star Wars has gotten into the habit of doing something it really needs to stop, and that's relying on stakes that are somehow, some way, spoiled. By that I mean, Star Wars has a tendency to tell stories whose stakes aren't nearly as strong as they should be, because they can't. And then there's no real reason to care about those stories. For this video, I'll be focusing solely on the live-action Star Wars media, which includes the 9 core films and Disney Plus TV shows. That's because they're the most important installments in the franchise. Every other spin-off is tied to them. Now, what exactly does Star Wars do to undermine its own stakes? Well, without further ado, let's gut this franchise like a tauntaun. In order for a story's stakes to be even remotely interesting, it requires a little secret ingredient: uncertainty. For example, if Luke Skywalker and the Rebel Alliance don't defeat the evil Empire, it'll continue to rain terror onto the galaxy. And as the original Star Wars movies were coming out between 1977 and 1983, the compellingness of those stakes was strengthened by the fact that viewers didn't know what the story's outcome and ultimate fates of its characters was going to be. For all they knew, the final film could have ended with Luke and crew waking up on the floor of a Denny's at 1 o'clock in the morning, realizing their entire adventure had been nothing more than a shared hallucination driven by undercooked sausage links and LSD. The only other trilogy of Star Wars movies that manages to capture this uncertainty is the sequel trilogy, chronologically taking place about 30 years after the original films. They introduce us to the characters Rey, Finn, and Poe, along with the evil First Order, which, should it succeed, would fill the role of the fallen Empire. Like forgetting to include a target practice class in the employee training program. From 2015 to 2019, the movies posed significant questions that had fans endlessly speculating between releases. Would the First Order win and the galaxy slip back into turmoil? Would Rey turn evil over the course of the trilogy and die? Would the villain, Kylo Ren, turn good and live? The uncertainty gave the stakes weight, because there was nothing to suggest that things could only go one way. Aside from those 6 films, everything's a prequel. Every other Star Wars project is either set before movies or between them, all intricately tied to the core films, but none advancing the overall chronology whatsoever. So no matter what happens in them, the stakes, the consequences they present in their stories as being possible aren't believable because you already know what's going to happen in the overall franchise. Let's look at some examples. The worst offender I've saved for last. We'll start with Ahsoka. This TV show takes place in the 30-year gap between the original and sequel trilogies. It follows Ahsoka. Yeah, I know the creativity behind some of these show titles is staggering. She's a magical space wizard called a Jedi on a mission to stop the evil Grand Admiral Thrawn, or as I like to call him, Papa Smurf on a bad day, from escaping his exile and assuming his role as heir to the Empire, bringing its fragments back together again. At the end of the show's first season, he succeeds and escapes, but it's difficult to really feel any kind of tension because we already know what's going to happen. The show takes place before the sequel trilogy, remember? Well, in those movies, the Empire is still not around. The villainous First Order is. So obviously Thrawn doesn't accomplish what he's set up in Ahsoka to do. Even if it's revealed his efforts to rebuild the Empire end up creating the First Order, while that's interesting, it doesn't bring me to the edge of my seat because we already know the First Order gets defeated in the sequel trilogy's final film. The Rise of Skywalker. And speaking of The Rise of Skywalker, there's a scene at the film's end where the deceased Jedi of the past 1,000 generations give their energy to Rey so that she can defeat the villain and save the day. And among those dead voices, sadly enough, is Ahsoka. So you don't even have to watch one episode of the Disney Plus show to know that Thrawn's goals fail, and somewhere along the line, Ahsoka dies too. This all makes the stakes Ahsoka is trying to present difficult to get invested in. How can I hope that Ahsoka is going to live when I know she'll die? How can I be frightened by Thrawn when I already know he's going to lose? Another prequel Star Wars show that suffers from this is called Andor, which follows Cassian Andor, a character that was actually introduced a number of years ago in another prequel called Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, a movie set right before the start of the original trilogy, and right at the end of his life. So even though Andor is just brilliant in how it showcases new sides of old planets like Coruscant, contains heart-pumping action sequences, and arguably the best acting and writing of the franchise.
Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything!
Despite these things, you don't watch the show feeling like Andor is actually in any real danger because you know he has to survive until the events of Rogue One, which happened 5 years later on the timeline. For instance, the show starts off with him killing 2 Imperial officers, which begins a manhunt for him after they figure out his identity, but you're never worried he'll get caught and executed because in Rogue One, he's working with the rebels. It's the same case for when he, for completely other reasons, gets captured and put in a prison that kind of looks like what one would be if Apple designed it. It's clean, minimalistic, typically key features are absent. You've even got a Siri for company.
On program, feet down, face front, hands on heads. We will have immediate facility compliance or we will begin activating floors without warning.
But you just know that he's got to successfully break out eventually, so it's hard to get invested in the stakes the show is trying to present. Now, the biggest example of a show suffering from spoiled sakes is definitely Obi-Wan Kenobi, a show centered on Obi-Wan Kenobi, an exiled Jedi Master set about 9 years before the original trilogy. It also features a young Leia Organa, Luke Skywalker's sister, who he must save and return to her family before his former apprentice, now known as Darth Vader, can get to her. These two, of course, clash pretty heavily in lightsaber duels, but it's the equivalent of a fireworks show. It's all spectacle with no real tension. We know Obi-Wan must live because we see him in the original trilogy's first movie, A New Hope. We know Leia must live because we see her throughout the original, even the sequel trilogy. We know Darth Vader can't die because that doesn't happen until the original trilogy's final film, Return of the Jedi. No one's life is on the line. Characters talk about hunting and killing each other, but it's basically sibling banter. At one point, a character gets stabbed, and at the time, no one believed he was actually dead, because he appears in an animated show called Star Wars Rebels, which came out before, but takes place after Obi-Wan Kenobi. And they were right. Star Wars spoiled itself. No one can actually do anything too crazy, because they're bound by canon. But the thing is, that's what prequels are. By design, they're not supposed to hinge on stakes. They're supposed to reveal mysteries and expand on details and projects that take place afterward. This was the allure of what's known as the prequel trilogy. At no point in those movies was anyone thinking, oh no, whatever will happen to Anakin Skywalker. We all knew he was going to end up like smoked brisket. The prequel trilogy was about filling in the blanks, expanding upon a history and tragedy only alluded to by the main characters in the original 3 films. So if prequels aren't supposed to rely on stakes to make their stories interesting, what's the problem here? Quantity. Like I said earlier, when you look at the projects the Star Wars franchise has released over the last 5 years, it's all prequels. The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, The Acolyte, prequels. And when you look forward to the foreseeable future, they're all prequels too. Ahsoka Season 2, Andor Season 2, both prequels. The Mandalorian and Grogu, a prequel. James Mangold's Star Wars movie set 25,000 years in the past, prequel with the capital P, all except one. Just one project on the slate takes place after the sequel trilogy, in a new, never-before-seen era of the galaxy where for the first time in a while, we've got no idea what the ending's going to be like. Now, I'm not saying there should be no more prequel projects. They're a fun way to expand upon the histories of successful films. Being able to watch those films later on with the added context makes their stories richer and livelier. What I am saying is that there needs to be balance. It's ironic, really. For a franchise where there's an ethereal force behind all living things whose existence hinges on the balance between light and dark, good and evil, Jedi and Sith, the creators behind this franchise are astonishingly imbalanced because they keep only making one type of thing. There need to be just as many projects pushing the narrative forward as there are ones building on the back end of things, because then you can have that uncertainty again. You can make stories with stakes that feel like they can be taken seriously again. But even if Star Wars did exactly this, it wouldn't fix everything. No, folks, this is a layered problem, and making too many prequels is just the first. There also aren't enough good bad guys. Stakes feel like nothing if there isn't a worthy antagonist threatening to make things go sideways for the characters. Because if they don't feel like a real threat, then it's like the main characters have already won. And in the 45 plus years since Star Wars first graced movie theaters, there are only two villains in the live action media that managed to do this: the original trilogy's nefarious mastermind Emperor Palpatine and his apprentice Darth Vader, the galaxy's most romantic couple. They're great not just because they look scary. Palpatine with his hooded robes and complete lack of a skincare routine, Darth Vader with his nightmare armor and extreme vitamin D deficiency, but because they actually win sometimes. In the prequel trilogy's final film, Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine succeeds in taking over the Galactic Republic and committing genocide against the Jedi, fulfilling his quest for power. And in the original trilogy's second film, The Empire Strikes Back, Vader successfully lures Luke Skywalker into a trap, beats him within an inch of his own life, and even manages to turn his friend Han Solo into living room wall art. No other villain in Star Wars is like this. There's only one that comes at least a little close, and I'll get to him in a second, but the rest? See for yourself. Darth Maul sliced in half after a surprise acrobatic show. Count Dooku decapitated in the first 15 minutes of episode 3. General Grievous dismembered like a Red King crab in a mukbang. No good villains. None win, none last beyond the movie they're introduced in, except Count Dooku, but like barely. Fast forward to the sequel trilogy and we get Kylo Ren, the former student of Luke freaking Skywalker, who loses to a girl who picked up a lightsaber literally for the first time. You've got General Hux, who wants you to think he's a villain until he's revealed to be a spy. So he's not a villain. And then you've got Supreme Leader Snoke, who dies because he, a supposed master of the dark arts, gets a little distracted. My god, Jar Jar's a more compelling antagonist than these guys. Too many villains in Star Wars are weak, one-off characters that are, in all honesty, just there to set the stage so Emperor Palpatine can kick ass in the trilogy's final movie. And of course to sell action figures too. And there's nothing wrong with selling action figures. At the end of the day, making movies is not free and money needs to be made, but there must be balance. We need more villains that actually feel like a threat. And yes, maybe that means they win a couple of times, but it's necessary to show that they can hold their own and put up a fight. If they can't, the fight's already been lost. The only other villain that I find to be at least somewhat on the caliber of Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine is Grand Admiral Thrawn. He's cool, he's calculated, he wins, he's blue, da-ba-dee-da-ba-die, and he's not a one-off. He's set to return for future projects. There should be more like him. I'd be thrilled if his ending wasn't already spoiled. Which brings me to the last point I want to make, and coincidentally enough, it has to do with endings. After the story's been told and the consequences have been felt, there's only one thing you can do to undermine things, both spoiling the stakes in hindsight and setting a precedent that spoils stakes in the future. I'm talking, of course, about bringing back things from the dead. Death is the ultimate consequence. In Star Wars, it's what the stakes almost always boil down to. The possibility of the death of the Rebel Alliance, death of the Empire, death of the Jedi, of the Sith, of the First Order, and so on and so forth. But if you eliminate death, then you eliminate the consequence. Now this happens a lot because in the Star Wars lore, those who become masters of the Force that binds all of reality together can retain their consciousness in it after dying. For example, we've got Yoda who dies in Return of the Jedi, then there he is again at the end of the movie. Kinda not so sad for him anymore. It's not too bad though, since Yoda was 900 years old at the time of his demise and was very strong with the Force, so okay, but who's that next to him? Darth Vader? You mean the guy who spent the last 20 years hating everyone? The guy who killed the younglings? Still, you could argue that he let go of his hate right before he died. He's also the chosen one, the one prophesized to bring balance to the Force and was immaculately conceived by it, so he's basically Jedi Jesus. Him becoming a Force ghost can still make sense. Then you got Luke and Leia becoming Force ghosts too, and while it does make it a little less special, it can still make sense. These were master Force users after all. But Kylo Ren, the guy who lost to a level 0 lightsaber duelist like a year before he dies, how's he a master? And Emperor Palpatine survived death. Where did he find the time to do that while he was getting incinerated in a pit? Qui-Gon's a Force ghost too. That's not fair, he didn't even finish his training. What's that? You say he finished his training after he died?
Oh, come on!
Then there's the scene where every Jedi who ever lived pushes their energy into Rey so that she can defeat Palpatine. What's going on with that? The Force is granting immortality like a crazed Oprah Winfrey. If everyone gets to be a special ghost, then no one's a special ghost. But it doesn't end there. You see, Star Wars is clever. This is a problem with multiple dimensions to it. Han Solo died in The Force Awakens, and then his character received a whole prequel movie based on his early life. Even though his story's done, his character's been laid to rest, and giving us more content with him in it just cheapens the sacrifice he made in Episode 7. The Empire dies, but then in the sequel trilogy we get the First Order, which operates like the Empire, has the same goals of galactic domination as the Empire, and features stormtroopers that look practically identical to the old ones in the Empire. Luke Skywalker's old lightsaber gets split in half. That's totally not coming back, right? Well, in the next movie, it's been put back together with the Star Wars equivalent of duct tape and is fully functional again. His X-Wing fighter has been sitting submerged underwater for years. There's no way that waterlogged, rusty hunk of junk is ever gonna grace the skies again. What? How the fuck do the electronics still work on that thing? The Death Star gets blown up. 2 movies later, the second one gets blown up. 30 years later, the one after that gets blown up.
No one's ever really gone.
But that's not good storytelling, because how can you care? Why should I worry that a Jedi might die if apparently they're all going to come back as a ghost? Yeah, I know some are just voices and some are full body apparitions, but I don't care. They're all the same to me. If you're coming back from the dead, you're a ghost. Why should I appreciate a character's self-sacrifice if they're just going to show up in more movies? Why should I care about a villain's defeat for the same reason? Why should I care about any consequence if it's just going to get undone in the next movie? Because the franchise can't let go of anything, at the end of the day, the only thing that's really dead is the story stakes. It's really ironic yet again. In the movie The Phantom Menace, you have Yoda imploring a young Anakin Skywalker how important it is to not be afraid to let go in life, because
fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
In other words, my current state of mind, Star Wars needs to take a lesson from Star Wars. And that's about all I've got to say on the matter. If nothing changes, well then I hope we can all look forward to Star Wars Episode 10, where it's revealed Emperor Palpatine's soul attached itself to Poe's eyelash, and Luke Skywalker must train Rey Skywalker so she can train the next generation of Skywalkers to defeat him. With, of course, a cameo or two from Anakin Skywalker, because you know how he loves the younglings. Until then, Star Wars fans, live long and prosper.